Chapter 9, Coming Around. My stay with the Turnbows was day by day. The days turned into weeks, with still no word of where I would end up. And out of frustration, Alice enrolled me into Parkside Junior High. As happy as I was to return to school to see my teachers again, I still felt a dark cloud over me. I dreaded walking to Alice's home after school. I'd peek around the corner, looking for a county car, knowing I'd soon be driven off. Every day out of fear, I'd bug Alice. In my desperate effort to find out any news from Gordon Hutchinson, I just wanted to know. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself still sleeping on the couch and living out of a grocery bag. My clothes became weathered and moldy because I only washed them on Saturday afternoon. Page 256. After 3 p.m. or on a Sunday, I knew that those were the only times I was safe from being moved. After forgetting my pet turtle at the Catans, I didn't want to take the chance of losing anything else again. And every night, after everyone had gone to bed, I would pray on the couch that tomorrow Gordon would decide my fate. One day, when I returned to Alice's home after school, she sat me down. I swallowed hard as I braced myself for the bad news, but no word had come. Alice informed me of something else. I would be seeing a psychiatrist tomorrow. I shook my head no. Alice went on to explain that she understood about the problems about my former doctor, and I was surprised that she knew so much about my past when I hadn't told her anything. "So you've been talking to my probation officer, and he still hasn't seen me?" I asked, feeling exposed and ashamed. Alice explained that she was working on a plan to have me placed with her, but it would take time to receive a license to have boys in her home. "But not to worry," she stated. "Harold and I have decided that we would like you to stay with us for a while." Page 257. Without hesitating, I gave Alice a kiss, and then I thought about her last statement and gave her a frown. "You mean Harold wants me to stay too?" Alice laughed. "Just because Harold doesn't talk that much to you doesn't mean he doesn't like you. He just has a hard time understanding you. Frankly, I'm sure a lot of people would. But take my word, if Harold didn't want you, you wouldn't be here." Her big hands wrapped around my skinny fingers. "Oh, Leo likes you more than you know." Alice's explanation of Harold meant the world to me. Ever since I had blurted out to him about sharing a room with a girl, I felt Harold thought of me as a weird kid. He never seemed to talk to me, and whenever he did utter a few words in my direction, he tried to get me to read rather than watch television. And every night after dinner, like clockwork, Harold would always pull out an old Western paperback, smoke his Camel cigarettes before going to bed precisely at 9 p.m. I respected Harold so much, although he never knew. As a carpenter, he had a passion for his craft, and I hoped I could stay with the Turnbows long enough for Harold to teach me a few things. Ever since I was a small child, I had fantasized about building a log cabin at the Russian River. So at times, I'd imagine Harold and me working on a project together. Page 258. In hopes of bringing us closer. Maybe, I thought, by then I could prove myself to him. The next day, after much prying from Alice, I hopped on a bus and I went to meet my new psychiatrist, Dr. Robertson, who turned out to be the complete opposite of the great doctor I had before. He greeted me with a handshake and told me to call him by his first name, Donald. His entire office was bathed in bright, warm sunlight, but the thing that meant the most to me was that Dr. Robertson treated me like a person. On my weekly visits to Dr. Robertson, I never felt forced to talk about anything, but soon found myself initiating a conversation about my past. I questioned Dr. Robertson about everything, including whether I was doomed to follow in my mother's footsteps. Dr. Robertson always tried to steer me in another direction, but I fought to maintain my lifelong course of finding my answers. I learned to trust him as he gently led me through the maze of the sensitive parts of my past. Because of my persistence, Dr. Robertson suggested some books for me to study on, basic psychology. And soon afterward, Harold and I seemed to bicker about who was hogging the lamp by the end of the couch. Page 259. As I tried to read books on self-esteem by Norman Vincent Peale or others on the stranger side, such as Your Awareness Zones, I found myself intrigued with the basic theories of survival traits as written by Dr. Abraham Maslow, and at times I'd become frustrated with the big words, but I hung tough and soon discovered it had taken a lot just for me to make it as far as I had. Although on the inside parts of me still felt awkward and hollow, I realized I was stronger than most of the kids at school who seemed to live a normal world. At Alice's home, I found myself opening up to her about everything, all the time. Sometimes she and I would gab far into the early morning hours, and I never worried about how I talked or what I said. And whenever I became nervous and began to stutter, Alice would teach me how to slow down my train of thought and have me picture myself saying the words before I spoke them. Within a few weeks, my speech problem disappeared. Every Saturday afternoon, after Alice danced her usual jig to American Bandstand, she and I would venture past the railroad tracks on our way to the same mall where Mrs. Catan's had taken me shopping for my clothes. We always saw a movie, and that was the only way Alice could get me to sit still for any length of time. Page 260. As I sat quietly beside her, I'd wring my hands as I scrutinized every scene. My mind raced to stay one step ahead of the sometimes mindless plot. I became fascinated by complicated screenplays and how the director pieced everything together. And after every show, Alice and I went back and forth with our own critiques. Other times, for no special reason, she would buy me toys just because. At first, I felt awkward and unworthy, partly because I was not used to receiving presents, and also because I knew how hard Harold worked and how he saved every penny. In time, I learned to accept presents. For me, that was a very hard lesson to swallow. The most important gift the Turnbows gave me was my one last chance at being a kid, while preparing me for my life as an adult. In an effort to show Alice and Harold how much they meant to me, one afternoon at the kitchen table, the famed table of talk, I plucked a soiled piece of torn paper from my pant pocket and ripped it into tiny fragments. Now what's all that about? Harold scowled as tears rolled down Alice's cheeks. I don't need it anymore, I boasted. And I know your phone number too. Want to hear? Alice nodded her head yes. Page 261. It's 555-2647, I proudly stated as I looked straight into Harold's blue eyes. Well, maybe now's the time to get that unlisted phone number, he grumbled before winking at me. Whenever Alice and I talked for any great length of time, the subject of my future always came up. Even the simple question, what do you want to do when you grow up, David, caused me to become scared from the bottom of my soul. I always seemed to picture Chris, the foster kid from the Catan's home, and how frightened he was to turn 18. I had never thought that far ahead. In order to survive against Mother's torture, I only had to plan hour by hour, or day by day at the most. Being alone in the wide open world was the most frightening thing I could ever possibly imagine. I'd become so scared and tense that I began to stutter again. And Alice always seemed to calm me down, but at night, when I finally had a room of my own to sleep in, I'd shiver with fear at the thought of how I was going to buy food or where I would live. I would think so hard that I'd fall asleep with an enormous headache. For me, at age 15, the countdown had begun. Page 262. Soon, after the initial shock wore off, I decided to find ways to make money. I started out by shining shoes, and my first day out I earned $21, polishing dozens of shoes in just under 6 hours. I felt so proud as I juggled my shoe shine kit and a box of donuts in one hand, and a bouquet of flowers for Alice, and a couple of paperback books for Harold in the other. I soon added a job at the watch repair shop, where I worked for about 20 hours a week for $10.25 take-home pay. The amount of money wasn't important to me. At the end of the worst week, I'd fall asleep feeling I had accomplished something. And that was what was important. While other kids played street ball or hung around the mall, I was becoming self-sufficient. It was very difficult for me to find anything I had in common with other kids at school. Most of them fought to impress me by acting cool. I knew that on the outside I didn't fit in, so I simply gave up trying. At times, I played the role of class clown, but for the most part, I didn't care what my classmates thought of me. Whenever they bragged about their weekend ski trips, I'd think about how I could squeeze in an extra hour of work. One Friday, a few weeks before I graduated from Parkside Junior High, a group of rich kids were bragging, page 263, about their upcoming graduation and plans of going to Disneyland or traveling to Hawaii first class. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I ran from the bus stop that afternoon and I nearly knocked down the screen door to Alice's home. "What is it?" she shrieked. I gulped down a glass of water before answering. I was pushing 16 now, and I didn't know how to cook for myself. Alice assured me that she would teach me when the time came. I persisted. I wanted to learn how to cook now. I gave her one of my serious looks, the kind I had learned from Mrs. Catan's, who always placed her hands on her hips. And it worked. Even though Alice had just cleaned her home for their bridge party, which would be held in just a couple of hours, she decided to teach me how to make pancakes. Alice's decision was her undoing. In a matter of minutes, I went through 2 boxes of Bisquick pancake mix, 4 dozen eggs, and 2 gallons of milk. Every square inch of the gas stove was covered with a thick, white, gooey mix. The ceiling was splattered with a few well-intended tossed pancakes, and the floor looked as if a blizzard had blown through. And every time Alice or I shuffled across it, we nearly suffocated from the clouds of white powder. Page 264. The strain on her face was quite visible, but she laughed with me, and I didn't quit until I had made the perfect pancake. Every day seemed to hold a new adventure. Sometimes, after school, I'd play on the living room floor with my Legos or my erector set, while other times I was a little big man returning to Alice's home after school just long enough to change clothes before zipping off to work at one of my jobs. For the first time, I had a real life. By July of 1976, my life took another turn. I grew tired of riding my bike to work every morning while everyone else was still fast asleep. Then one afternoon, after a frustrating day on the job, I returned from work to find that no one, not one, but 2 older foster boys had moved in. I took an instant dislike to one of the boys, Bruce, partly because I had to share a room with him, and partly because he knew he got away with conning Alice blind. And even though both boys were 17, they didn't seem too concerned about supporting themselves. I began to resent them, both. And whenever I pedaled off to work, they spent the day at the mall with Alice. And in an odd sense, I felt threatened and violated by their presence. I knew my childlike times with Alice were over, but I just wanted to hang on a little bit longer before I had to grow up. Page 265. After a few weeks, I discovered that my stash of money and some of the things I had bought through my earnings were missing, and at first I thought I had misplaced my items. But one day, for no special reason, I had enough. I marched up to Alice, and I demanded that either they leave or I would. I knew I sounded like a spoiled brat, but I could no longer tolerate trying to hide my things all the time, wondering how to work to make up for stolen money. Everything I had worked so hard for slowly disappeared. I hoped Alice would give in, but I soon found myself packing. I felt like a complete fool leaving the turnbows. To me, it was a matter of honor. If I said something, I had to be responsible for my word. So I stayed at juvenile hall for a few weeks, until my new probation officer, Mrs. Orion, placed me with John and Linda Walsh, a young couple in their 20s who had 3 kids. John had long black hair and played piano in a rock and roll band, while Linda was a beauty consultant at the local Walgreens drugstore. They were both very nice, and I was extremely surprised by their carefree attitude. They pretty much allowed me to do as I pleased. When I wanted to buy a mini bike, John said yes. Page 266. One day, when I timidly asked John if he could drive me to a local sports shop so I could buy a BB gun, he replied, "Let's go." I was stunned. I would have never even thought of asking Mr. or Mrs. Turnbow, but John didn't even blink. His only condition was that he had to teach me gun safety, and I could only shoot against paper targets under his supervision. I soon forgot about looking for another job and developed the Walsh's laid-back attitude. A few weeks into my freshman year in high school, John and Linda told me they were moving. Without thinking, I huffed into the room I shared with their 2-year-old boy, and I crammed everything I owned into a pillowcase. I was livid. It seemed that every time I adjusted to a new environment, something happened. I realized that John and Linda seemed to fight all the time, but I got used to that, as well as having to babysit their bratty kids. With all my belongings slung over my shoulder, I marched back into the living room. "All right," I demanded. "Let's go. Take me to the hill." John and Linda both looked at each other and laughed. "No, man," John said as he waved his hand in front of his face. "I said we're moving. You're coming with us." Page 267. That is, if you don't have a problem with that. I became so upset at myself, so I stood in front of them and I stewed for several minutes until I smiled and said, "I don't know what you two are laughing at, but I'm already packed. What about you?" Linda jabbed John in the gut. Smart kid. The next day I stood in the back of an oversized U-Haul while John drove to the edge of the county. When he finally stopped, I leaped from the trailer. I couldn't believe what I saw. It was as if the Walshes and I had moved into the Leave It to Beaver neighborhood. I stepped around the U-Haul, gawked at the entire block. Every lawn was perfectly manicured. The immaculate houses looked more like miniature mansions than ordinary homes, and every car in its driveway had a blinding shine, as if it had just been waxed. As I strolled down the middle of the Dunsmore Drive, I breathed in the sweet smell of flowers, and I could hear the sound of the wind fluttering through a giant weeping willow. I shook my head and smiled inside. Yes, I shouted, I could live here. In no time at all, I made friends with Paul Brazil and Dave Howard, 2 neighborhood teenagers who seemed fascinated by my dark, rusty red mini bike and my Daisy BB gun. Page 268. Their eyes seemed hungry for adventure. I was more than happy to feed them. I discovered Paul had a mini bike too, and soon the 3 of us held drag races in the middle of the lifeless street. Paul always won for 3 reasons. His mini bike had more horsepower than mine, he weighed less than I did, and he had brakes, allowing him to slow down long after I did. Out of the hundreds of races I won, only one. That day, my throttle became stuck. I wasn't worried since I had a cutoff switch, which I immediately discovered would not shut off the engine. Since I didn't have any brakes, I tried to slow down by dragging my feet, but as I did, my shoes slipped and the bottom of my shirt became caught in the rear sprocket. For a moment, I had one hand on the throttle while the rest of my body flailed before being dragged down the middle of the street. I was too scared to let go. I finally released my grip, and a split second later, my mini bike jumped a sidewalk, flying up and over a bush. Just in front of me, Dave hit the ground, rolling with laughter. Seconds later, Paul pulled up. His eyes were as big as silver dollars. "Man, that was too cool. Can you do that again?" As I struggled to stand up, page 269, I could see some of the adults in the neighborhood staring in our direction. They seemed more concerned over the damage to the bush than to my medical condition. And trying to forget the unfriendly looks, I blocked out the pain and gave Paul my widest smile. From that moment on, I was dubbed the stunt master of Dunsmore. That evening, the 3 of us plotted our next adventure. Paul's parents had a 16mm camera, so Paul decided to make a James Bond-style movie, casting me as the lead actor. The climax of the film was to have Dr. Strange, played by Dave, drag Bond up and down the street while Paul filmed from all angles. I told Paul I wasn't so sure about the stunt, while Dave panted like a dog, claiming he wouldn't mind watching my knees turn into hamburger. Dave doubled as my stunt coordinator, which entailed keeping the street clear of all traffic under the age of 10 and having a set of Band-Aids at the ready whenever my gag was completed. I was thankful the next day when Paul's camera ran out of film, before my death-defying climax. One day, Paul helped me to prepare to meet a girl from around the block. I had never talked to a girl before, but Paul loaned me his best shirt and coached me on what to say. At that time in my life, I was barely looking at myself in the mirror. Page 270. Let alone having the confidence to talk to a girl. After combing my hair, hearing more about coaching, and having no more excuses, I let Paul kick me out of his house, and I strolled down Dunsmore. As I turned the corner, I felt like a normal person. I lived in a perfect neighborhood. My foster parents let me do as I wished, and I didn't have to work. And most important, my life was centered around the best friends in the entire world. Minutes later, I rapped on the front door and waited. My hands shook, and I felt lightheaded as sweat seemed to escape from every pore of my body. I was actually excited to be a little bit frightened. This was a good scare. I began to rub my hands when the door opened. I thought my mouth would fall to the floor. I felt tingly all over as I stared into the face of the prettiest girl I had ever seen. Without the girl knowing, I regained my composure as she began to talk. The more she spoke, the better I felt about myself. I couldn't believe how easy it was to make this girl laugh. I was enjoying myself, right up until the moment when the girl's mother pushed her aside. And it took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, I looked up at a woman who looked more like the lady, page 271, from the Brady Bunch than someone's mother. The woman quickly jabbed a finger in front of my face. "You're that little F-child, aren't you?" She sneered with a tight smirk on her face. I was too stunned to speak. "Have you no respect for elders? Answer me, boy." "Ma'am?" I said, shaking my head. "Listen to me," the woman raved. "I know all about you. And those motorcycles making all that reverberant noise and that willful destruction of private property. How did the association ever approve of your kind of people residing in our neighborhood? I know all about your kind. You're a filthy little hooligan. Just look at your attire. You reek of street trash. I don't know what you children did to become fostered children," she said, covering her mouth as if she had just spoken a swear word. "But I'm sure you did something hideous, didn't you?" The woman's face turned so red that I thought she was going to explode. "Don't you dare approach my household or converse with my children. Ever. Ever." I stood, mesmerized by the woman's perfectly manicured red fingernail in my face. Page 272. "And just a piece of advice," the woman went on. "Don't waste your time trying. You don't have what it takes to make it, I know, believe me. I'm actually doing you a favor." She smiled as she tossed her hair to the other side of her face. "You'll see, I'm a very open-minded person who knows a thing or two. So the sooner that you learn that you're only an F-child, the better off you'll be. So stick with your own kind." Before I could respond, the front door slammed shut with such a fury that I felt a rush of air hit my face. I stood by the door, dumbstruck. I didn't know what to do. I felt as if I were an inch tall. I gazed at the sleeves of Paul's red and black flannel shirt. They were a little short, but I thought the shirt looked nice. I ran my head through my oily hair. "I guess I could use a bath," I muttered to myself. I knew that on the outside I was a walking geek, but on the inside I felt better about myself than ever before. I tried so hard to do things that normal kids took for granted. I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to be like a normal kid. Minutes later, with my head hung low, I passed Paul, who danced around me as he pestered me with questions about meeting a girl. I waved off my best friend, hid in my room for the rest of the day. Page 273. The next afternoon, while I was tinkering with my mini bike, a tall man walked up to me with a beer can in one hand and a baby stroller in the other. Page 273. "So you're the neighborhood threat?" he said with a sly grin. I kept my head down as I felt my body temperature begin to rise. Before I could mouth off, the man breezed on by. About half an hour later, the man reappeared in the opposite direction. I waited for another put down, but this time I was ready to fire off an insult. But he gave me a wide smile before saying, "Good on you, boy. Get some." I shook my head, thinking my ears were clogged. Good on me? Get some? Get some what? I asked myself. I stood up, wiped a spot of black oil onto my dirty white tank top, and watched the man as he bobbed past me in the driveway next door. He gave me another nod before disappearing into the garage, and I was so stunned that I sat down on the grass and thought about what the crazy man meant. As demented as he seemed, he did have a way with words. The next afternoon, same time, the man reappeared, same outfit, a pair of white shorts that showed off his ash-white bony knees. Page 274. An undersized t-shirt that read, "Fudpuckers, we've been flying since the world's been square." A baseball cap with silver-winged feathers pinned in the middle, and a cigarette that seemed to dangle from his bottom lip. Again, with a beer in one hand and a baby stroll in the other, he stopped in front of me and winked. "Airborne material you're not, but don't worry, Slim, every dog has his day." And he pushed on. I repeated his message over and over again as I tried to find a meaning to the phrase, "every dog has his day." Just like clockwork, the man returned 30 minutes later. I jumped up and waited for his eloquent words of wisdom. "Know this," the man said with a bow. "There's always profit in mass confusion." "Hey, mister," I said before I could think. The man's head spun around like a top. "You inquired?" My mouth hung open. I didn't know how to respond. I could feel myself choke up. He bowed his head. "If you can wash your hands and change your attire, you may join me at my humble abode." In a flash, I raced through the Walsh's house, scrubbed my arms and hands, dirty in their bathroom sink, and changed my shirt before bursting through the man's front door. Page 275. Before I could yell my presence, a giant hand slapped me in the center of my chest. I lost my breath and thought my chest would cave in. The man looked down and smiled. "Let's try that again, shall we?" he said as he led me out the front door and closed it in my face. I frowned to myself. How rude, I said out loud, and for a moment I thought I was being put down the way that Brady Bunch lady had done. I was about to leave when I heard a muffled voice from behind the door state, "Knock on the door." I rolled my eyes as my knuckles rapped on the front door. A moment later, the door flung open and the man bowed at the waist as he waved his arm, permitting me to enter. He smiled as he introduced himself. "Michael Marsh, keeper of the faith, soldier of fortune, and the Doc Savage of Doonesmore Drive." And so began my first of many visits to Marsh Manor. Days later I met Mr. Marsh's wife, Sandra, who was quiet and shy compared with her peculiar husband, and I was instantly taken with their two boys, William and Eric. Watching their toddler, Eric, dribble as he crawled around the house reminded me of my brother Kevin when he was that age. Page 276. The Marshes treated me like a real person. And while the Walshes argued more than ever, the Marshes' home became my safe haven. And whenever I was not promoting chaos with Paul and Dave, I spent hundreds of hours sitting in the corner of Michael's famed Hall of Knowledge, reading books about movies, race cars, and airplanes. Ever since I was a prisoner in Mother's house, I developed a fascination for aircraft, and the many times I would sit on top of my hands at the bottom of the cold garage, I'd escape by fantasizing I was Superman. I always wanted to fly. And although I was never allowed to take any of Mr. Marsh's books to the Walsh's home, I'd sometimes sneak off with a book and stay up all night, reading about the real-life adventures of World War II fighter pilots, or the development of a specialized aircraft like the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. Michael's library opened up a whole new world to me, and for the first time in my life I began to wonder what it would be like to fly aboard a real airplane. Maybe, I thought, one of these days. Paul's father, Dan Brazil, was the Mr. Goodwrench of the neighborhood, and he had the same effect on me as Mr. Marsh. And at first, Mr. Brazil was wary of me, but eventually he began to tolerate my standing over his shoulder. Page 277. Quizzing his every movement. Sometimes Paul, Dave, and I would peek into Mr. Brazil's garage and stare in awe at whatever projects he was building from scratch. Whenever he left the garage for a few minutes, Paul would strut in, while Dave and I followed in Paul's footsteps for fear of disturbing a piece of metal or a place tool. However, as soon as the door opened, the three of us would scurry out of the garage before Dan caught us. We knew that the garage was a special domain where Dan, Michael, and a host of other men from the neighborhood gathered for their daily meetings. Sometimes, during the daily gatherings, a few of the men from the neighborhood frowned at me as they complained about the fear of plummeting real estate values in the local area. Mr. Marsh always came to my rescue. "Back off, boys," Michael once warned. "I have plans for my young ward. I predict that Mr. Pelzer here will become the next Chuck Yeager or Charles Manson. As you can see, I'm still working on the details." I smiled at the compliment. "Yeah," I nodded in defiance. "Charles Manson." I did feel a little foolish that I did not recall Charles Manson as an ace fighter pilot. Page 278. My times at Dunsmore were the best of my teenage life. At night, after reading one of Mr. Marsh's borrowed books, I'd fall asleep to the scent of flowers from a soft outside breeze, and every day after school carried a new adventure waiting for my two friends and me to discover. My stay at the Walshes was not so good. Raging arguments were a daily occurrence, and at times both of them would storm out of the house, leaving me to watch their children. Sometimes I'd try to time the fights so that before John and Linda began to hit each other, I could grab the youngest child and order the other two children to follow me outside until things calmed down. As much as I loved Dunsmore, I knew I couldn't keep living like I did. I felt like I had to do something. Finally, after an explosive argument, I called Mrs. O'Ryan, my probation officer, and I begged her to move me, even if it meant returning to the hill. Mrs. O'Ryan seemed pleased at my decision and thought she could convince the Turnbows to take me back. Leaving Dunsmore was one of the hardest decisions I had ever had to make. In a matter of months, in the tiniest fraction of my life, Dunsmore had given me so much. Page 279. I made it to a point not to say goodbye. Paul, Dave, and I seemed choked up, but we hid our feelings behind our age. The last moment, Dave gave me a hug. Mr. Brazil saluted me while holding a wrench, while Mr. Marsh presented me with a book on airplanes, the same book I had sneaked out of his house dozens of times. "You hooligan." He also gave me an autographed Delta airline postcard. On it, he had scrawled his address and his phone number. "Stay in touch, Slim," Michael said, as I felt myself beginning to get emotional. "Day or night, Sandra and I are here for you. Hang tough, Airborne. Get some." Before climbing into Harold Turnbow's ancient blue and white Chevy pickup, I cleared my throat and then announced in my Michael Marsh-like voice, "Shed no tears, have no fear, for I shall return," as Mr. Turnbow and I motored away from Dunsmore Drive. I saw the Brady Bunch woman who stood on her immaculate front porch with her arms tightly across her chest. She gave me a sneering smile. I smiled back before shouting, "Love you too." Almost an hour later, I burst through Alice Turnbow's screen door, and after a quick hug, she, page 280, pushed me away. "This is the last time," she warned. "Speak now or forever hold your peace." I nodded before replying. I know where I belong. 555-2647. Okay, that's the end of chapter 9. There's only one more chapter left. Coming soon. Be right back.